Good morning, everyone. Good morning to our panelists. My name is Lydia Mplaikis, and I'll be your host for today's panel discussion for Servant Leader. Happy Reconciliation Day. Today we celebrate a day that was fostered to mark the end of apartheid and to be a reminder of the unity and the power that we hold as a country and as a people. Servant Leader and Active Citizenship wishes you and your family a blessed Reconciliation Day. In true servant leader fashion, we will be celebrating Reconciliation Day by having a tough conversation about our history. Today's topic, like many other topics we have discussed before, is heavy but necessary. What many may refer to as South Africa's shadow is gender-based violence. Today's panel discussion will be different to our previous discussions, wherein we will be focusing not on one or two servant leaders that Professor Daniel Mplaikis had interviewed, but rather the panelists will share a quote or a motto from one of any of the interviews that stood out to them in reference to gender-based violence. Furthermore, I would like to give out a disclaimer to the audience as topics such as sexual and physical abuse will be mentioned throughout the discussion. Again, I would like to say I'm Lydia Mplaikis and I'm your host, and now I'll be handing over to our panelists to introduce themselves and their motto for today. Nick?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Nicholas Kruger, pronouns they, he. I am 20 years old, born and bred in Jozi, but I currently reside in Cape Town, where I'm studying my BA Theatre Performance, specializing in acting in my third year. The motto that I want to share in regards to the topic today is from the Ahmed Kathrada interview is servant leaders must listen to the people that they serve. And I think it's incredibly important that, especially coming from a male-bodied individual, that my job in this space when talking about sexual and gender-based violence is listening, is hearing the experiences and the opinions from people who are actually at the forefront of gender-based violence and are most affected by it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Caitlin?
Morning. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Caitlin. My pronouns are she, her, and I am an honors student studying through the University of Cape Town, doing my degree in politics, philosophy, and economics. And the motto or quote that I've chosen for today is from the interview with Geraldine, which is that servant leaders must never be silent. And I think that's really important when it comes to the topic of gender-based violence, because it's something that we need to talk about, and we need to create this sense of being able to speak out against gender-based violence, and also creating a space for victims of gender-based violence to be able to speak about their experiences and feel safe and comfortable to do so.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. Olwetu?
Hi, everybody. My name is Ola Tsukani. I am a second-year student at the University of Cape Town, studying towards my Bachelor of Social Science degree in politics, media and writing, and gender studies. My pronouns are she and her. And the motto that I'm going to basically talk about today is from Dr. Mangosuthu Buthelez's interview. And basically, he talks about having a deep-rooted passion and commitment and desire to take part in the liberation struggle. And I sort of applied that to today's discussion, in that we need a deep-rooted commitment to ending GBV because it's a human crisis. The same urgency and the same urgency and passion that was rooted in the liberation struggle for Black people during apartheid and even after apartheid. We need that energy to address the crisis that we're in with regards to gender-based violence.
Thank you so much, Olwetu. Oliver?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Oliver Ward. I am studying at UCT towards a BCom Financial Accounting degree. My pronouns are he, him, and today I will be discussing GBV, and my motto is of Ben Turok's interview, and a majority of his interview was around ethics and morals. And as an ethical leader, you should respect everyone's rights and dignities. And therefore, if you see a problem, you should do something about it and act on it. And as leaders in South Africa, and people as well, with principles, you have a gut feeling to help others and end GBV.
Thank you so much, Oliver. Puti, would you please introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Puti, and my pronouns go by he and him. And I am a 20-year-old University of Cape Town student studying a bachelor degree of performance, theatre and performance. I'm specializing under performance making. And the quote that I drew from was from Sophia de Brain, and she stated that things should never be swept under the carpet, and issues tend to boil up if you suppress them and put them on the side and look the blind eye, rather than, as the purpose for a servant leader is to confront and dissect the issue at hand so we can come to a resolution of what's critical. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Puti. Edith?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Edith Magaza. I'm a second-year student who is studying her BSOC sci in law, and so I've drawn my motto from Judge Kate O'Regan, and she speaks on how we all as South Africans bear a responsibility in every single thing we do to make it a better place here. And I think this applies to GBV simply because it's a conversation that requires everyone, both those who've been affected by it directly, those who perpetrate it, but also just those of us who bear witness to it. I think we can't just leave it to lawmakers or courtrooms to try and sort this out. This needs to be something that, from grassroots elements, we need to all be actively engaging in this discussion.
Thank you so much, Edith. And last but not least, Neo.
Hi everyone, my name is Neo Komete. I'm also a UCT student, currently studying a BA in theatre performance, streaming and acting. I also currently live in KZN. The motto that I'll be drawing from is from Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi's interview, in which talks about the triple oppression of women, that of the women, the Black women, and the working class women. And I think it's so inspiring that amongst the racial fights, she never disregarded the need to break down the patriarchy one step at a time and acknowledge that it wasn't just a fight for women, but a fight of man and woman against gender-based violence. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Neo, and thank you to our panelists. I'd like to remind the audience that you can also send any questions that you have for our panelists on the chat. To begin our discussion, I would like to start with the definition of gender-based violence. Gender-based violence is any type of harm that is perpetrated against a person or group of people because of the factual or perceived sex, gender, sexual orientation, and/or gender identity. As servant leader advocates, we wish for all perceived difficult conversations to lose that label. And as youth, we especially wish for our leaders not to shy away from any conversation that will allow us to move into a South Africa that we believe we can create. Although when it comes to gender-based violence, it is described as a topic that builds tension like no other issue, especially in South Africa. To Nick and Caitlin, why is that?
Can I go first? And yes, Caitlin, would you like to start us off?
I don't mind, you can start us off and I'll go next.
So I think, first of all, this question makes me feel a lot of things, because I feel like a lot of things we as South Africans, especially when we talk to people of older generations, and we talk about like things that we have to deal with because we're the future of the country, that we're going to be living here in the next 50 years. Things when any kind of issue, when it comes to class, race, gender-based violence, it's always hidden behind you can't talk about this sort of thing. Yeah, let's not mention politics at the table. But if we're not going to be talking about politics over dinner, what are we going to be talking about? There's only so many aunts and uncles that I can be talking about before we have to sit down and talk about what's really affecting us. So I think in saying that, there is a very good reason as to why it does build a legitimate sense of tension, is because it is an ongoing epidemic in our country that is affecting the lives of women and femme-bodied individuals all across South Africa. And in such ways, and when I say affect, I mean in so many ways, it ends up killing people. It's not something that a lot of people walk away from alive. In fact, yeah, if they do walk away from it alive, they walk away with years and a lifetime of psychological and physical trauma of what has been perpetuated against them. So the tension that is built is something that's real. I mean, every one of us watching this this panel right now, and everybody on this panel, including myself, knows at least one person who has been personally affected by the myriad of ways one could be harmed by gender-based violence. So it does build tension because it's a deeply personal issue for many of us.
Yeah, just to add on to what Nick said, I think it's an issue that is inherently traumatic for so many people that have experienced it, that have even just witnessed it, that know someone that has experienced it. And that level of trauma, it can be very triggering to have these discussions for people that have been victims and have been in those situations where they have experienced gender-based violence. So I think that is like the one hand. And then on the other hand, gender-based violence in South Africa is an all-encompassing problem, and it affects so many people, and there are so many perpetrators of gender-based violence. So when you bring up a conversation of gender-based violence, there's a very good chance that if you're talking in a group of 10 people, that there's at least one perpetrator in that group, because these instances of gender-based violence are not being committed by ghosts. They're not being committed by like strangers in dark alleys most of the time, even as well. These are people that are living and breathing and interacting in our communities. So when you bring up these topics of gender-based violence, not only are you having that, you need to have that sensitivity and awareness on the fact that this is a traumatic subject for many of the people that have experienced gender-based violence, but also the fact that you are likely having these conversations with people that have committed gender-based violence, and are they going to have some sort of level of defensiveness. They are wanting to minimize or downplay or deny the issue because they don't want to implicate themselves. They don't want to necessarily admit to themselves that they are the problem. They're part of the problem. And even beyond just the people who have perpetrated gender-based violence, the people that sit back and don't do anything when it happens and don't stand up for the women and the female individuals in their lives when they are subjected to mistreatment and assault and violence. So I think that's part of the reason that makes it such a difficult thing to talk about and brings up so much tension when you talk about these issues.
Thank you so much, Nick and Caitlin. So such true and valid responses. From what Nick said, when he said it's a continuous conversation that is being had, which is why it's such a tough conversation. And then also, Caitlin, when you said, when we're having this conversation, not only are there victims in the room, but they most probably will be perpetrators also in this room. And I think then the question comes out, then how do we feel? How does this make us feel? What does that mean as youth? How does this affect our daily lives as women, as LGBTQIA community? How does this affect our lives? We'll start with Olwetu. Thank you.
Yeah, it for survivors, like it affects like our lives in a very like life altering way, and I think like we touched on that in terms of you're living with trauma, you're living with the effects of being violated and the potential of it happening again. The effects of GBV like today means that as women, we have to take extra precaution to stay safe. We have to keep ourselves safe. It also like it sort of perpetuates this notion of like women or femme bodies just being subhuman, just from like how violent it all is, how inhumane it all is. So it perpetuates this notion from sort of the perpetrators, but also as women, like we see ourselves being violated in this way, and it's almost like while we're really disposable, or while we're really just objects, while we're not actually humans that have the right to life, have the right to equality, have the right to dignity. So there's like a wide range of sort of effects of GBV in terms of our daily lives. But also, I feel like the effect of or like sort of the responsibility of the impact of GBV is like largely placed on women or the victims or the survivors of GBV, and not enough pressure is placed on the structures that uphold it and that allow for it to continue happening. We don't focus on destabilizing patriarchal dynamics and power relations that uphold GBV. We don't work towards disrupting hegemonic ideals, cultural and social norms that oppress women. And in this way, if the structures are in place and the power dynamics aren't shifted, it's hard to see how anything will change, you know.
Thank you so much, Letu. Thank you. Now I move on to Oliver with the same question.
So I would like to repeat what Nick and Owetu said about the traumatic psychological effects that survivors of GBV have to deal with in their daily lives. Even the rehabilitation of the trauma will be difficult for them, and sometimes they have to deal with it on their own. And what we can do to help them is to listen to them, to believe them, and just to support them. They have to deal with it on their own, of course. We can't do everything. But many times survivors can't get the help that they need from clinics and hospitals. So perhaps that's something that leaders in South Africa and people like us could do, provide some support. And then something else that affects everyone else in South Africa are these costs of gender-based violence. I read an article where KPMG, an accounting firm, estimated like billions of rands that survivors and family members of these survivors have to go through just due to this violence that they had to encounter. You know, they lose their jobs because they have to take leave and they can't get their jobs back. Sometimes these are due to physical reasons, emotional reasons. Then there's the rehabilitation costs, the medical costs, the legal costs, divorcing your partner. So at the end of the day, it's also costs that you have to think about, monetary costs. Yeah.
Thank you, Oliver. I also think the point of that Oliver just raised, and then Owetu also kind of raised as well, is the very sad aftermath that comes out of GBV. Oliver spoke about how the cost effective of it, so people's daily lives are then interrupted. And a lot of these people then think of, should I then even come forth and say I was sexually assaulted? Because if I do that, then I may lose my job, I may lose my family, I may lose trust in the community. There's a whole lot of things that comes out of it, and I think that's very scary. And I think we as the youth and really need to force this upon our leaders, is to really make sure that this doesn't become a question that is asked by victims, where should I even say anything? And then it becomes then, was it my fault that any of this happened? And in thinking of this, because the question arises when thinking about this discussion is a lot about age and gender. And I know as a female, there's a certain focus on my body and how I should dress, how I should look, so that I don't invite the idea of being sexually harassed or abused on the street when I'm walking to the jammy stop, or even at university, or going out with my friends, just doing small, simple things, going to the shop. So my question is, when is the most appropriate age to start having this conversation? And how does this conversation be outlined to educate with intent to eradicate? And I think also we go to a point that was raised by Brendan on our chat, saying it pivotal in the discussion is the role of men and boys to take action to the end of all forms of violence against women and girls. So with those questions in mind, with this point, I would like to move to Putty and then to Edith. When is the most appropriate time to have this conversation in terms of age? And then how can this conversation be outlined? Thank you.
Age and GBV really correlate and intertwine. I personally feel that the most appropriate age to start having these heart-wrenching and critical conversation is when you're a kid. Like kids, when they're at the peak of under comprehension and listening, is we tend to find out that most of the statistics and the data, kids are the ones that are more at the forefront of being victimized under the umbrella of GBV because they're at the most vulnerable and they won't speak up because they're too afraid. They sweet talk and they're threatened by the people, those closest to them, the perpetrators. So starting at a young age to conscientize them about the situations laced within GBV is most critical so that they understand which steps to take if they were ever to be put in this situation. So the conversation needs to start when they're young, because if they don't say anything, it's only for them to grow up with that psychological and physical trauma of saying that I've been victimized and subjected to such horrendous violence, sexually, mentally, verbally, emotionally, when I was young, and I never got to speak up because I never got that education of learning what and understanding what this was. Had I known, I could have taken the necessary measurements to help eradicate GBV for people of my age. So, yes.
Thank you so much, Putty. Edith. And then also I'd like to point out to the group as well, if you'd like to add on this question after Edith answers, wherein I read an article where a lot of perpetrators, or it was perpetrators such as rapists, people who sexually abused, and then also murderers, they don't psychologically know what they're doing is wrong. And a lot of them reason it by saying that they didn't know when they were younger what they were doing was a violation to someone else's body. So this is then open to the floor, but first, Edith.
I think the conversation of GBV, I think there's a knee-jerk reaction from a lot of people to try and preserve it as being a conversation that needs to happen later in life. But I think just as Putty was bringing up, when it starts affecting kids as young as infancy, I remember there was the case of Tsepang from 2001, where it was this newborn baby girl who was already victimized by this situation. So you can't then start trying to delay this conversation and say, no, it needs to happen in high schools and varsities later on in life, because that's when people are old enough to be able to engage with the subject material, because the reality is that it affects people from the onset. I know when it comes to just like general dehumanization, when Lydian was talking about like how what dress and like what you're doing to garner some sort of attention, even though you didn't really do anything. I know my little sister at the age of like 11, 12 was already stressing whenever she walked to the shops about getting the attention of older men who could have been her father. And here they were dehumanizing her in those experiences. I remember turning 18 and not wanting to verbalize that I was 18, because then all of a sudden I wasn't a child anymore. And it became somewhat okay then to view me in that sort of a way, even though I had not asked for that sort of attention. I think, yeah, that all contributes to this fact that this conversation needs to happen from young. As for how to do it and how to include male-bodied individuals in these types of discussions, I think a conversation around consent can start from as young as toddler age, right? And it's small things, like things like asking a child whether or not they'd like a hug, or asking a child whether or not you're allowed to touch them. I think it's things that people often downplay the importance of, but it's those types of conversations lay the foundation for generalized consent and understanding consent. Because I think right now we have this huge debate around what consent even is. And you get people who turn around and say, okay, well, is it necessary? Does it not kill the mood? Does it not, like, ruin some sort of illusion of like, I don't know, romance or whatever, if I have to say something and like ask the other person, things like that. And it's like, no, every single time you are breaching that physical boundary, you need to ask someone. You need to say, hey, listen, is it all right if I put my hand on you like this? Is it okay if I touch you? Is it okay if I hug you? It's small things like that that graduate to GBV in the way we see it.
Thank you so much, Edith and Oliver. I think it's very much an evident conversation that needs to be had with younger children, especially. And I think it's very something that's quite close to my heart is this, what we're talking about now, the simple conversation, is something that falls under sex education. And when it comes to sex education, it should fall in heavy detail in our life orientation course and everything that needs to be learned there, because this right there, these simple things of consent, of whether you can touch me, whether you can hug me, and then also then of people as old as my father then looking at me in a certain way when I'm definitely not of age and not interested. Those kind of things, saying no is also the simple things that are small ways to introduce sex education into the school environment, most definitely. I think this is a perfect way to then segue to a question given to by the audience. It says, do you think the conversation of GBV lacks intersectionality? In other words, why does the recognition of the disproportionate harm experienced by women of color and poor and vulnerable women are left out of the conversation? Does the intersection of GBV and race or class make people feel uncomfortable? And I think I'll go to Nick for this. Thank you.
So to answer the first question of the question, do you think the conversation of GBV lacks intersectionality? I think in many cases it does tend to, and it lacks this. And just to go over intersectionality, in basic terms, it means how something can be affected by multiple things at once, or how it can fall into different categories at the same time. It's that whole idea that two things can be true at the same time. So yes, I do think it does. And I'd like to go to the quote that was shared by fellow panelist Neo about the working class Black woman, and how that phrase in itself is a good idea to start when we talk about intersectionality, because these words describe a very particular person, a person who is for the most part, if they're in the working class, they're economically oppressed by business leaders and those with financial power. They are a Black woman who historically speaking currently are some of the most oppressed people living in this country. And what we begin to see is that people experience oppressions and violences differently to where they fit in how the institutions we live in have ordered them. That people at the bottom feel it differently and more intensely than people at the top. Although people at the top still do feel it, they'll not feel it in the same way. So now we get to the next part. Why does the recognition of the disproportionate harm experienced by women of color and poor and vulnerable women left out of the conversation? And I believe that's because they are not the ones in power. We only hear from people who have the resources. It's that strange and ironic complaint that we hear from people saying, oh no, I was silenced, but yet I have 5 book deals, an interview on CNN, and multiple other ways that I can get out and say my words and spout my bigotry. But the matter of the fact is that they're not experiencing the same kind of oppression. They're not nearly feeling it as intensely if they have the power to speak their truth as they do. And I suppose why talking about this intersection makes people feel uncomfortable is because once again, it involves something deeply personal. If you're economically oppressed, your finances are still very much your own personal kind of situation that you deal with on your own. And now talking about that sort of thing with other people tends to make you feel very vulnerable. And that in itself is a form of oppression under the system, because it's the only people that don't want you talking about what you're getting paid are the people that are paying you. Because if you realize, if you start talking about what you're getting paid, with all the other people, you'll stand back and say, hold on, my labor is worth much more than this, yet they only pay me this much. It's these kind of oppressions that we need to like understand that affect on multiple levels. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. And I think what you said is very valid. And I think in terms of, I don't think it only comes in GBV, but it's especially evident to GBV. But I think in every single conversation in terms of politics, when you speak economic politics or you speak about just in every like part of politics, there's always come that does it lack intersectionality? Are we thinking about the people who are this is hurting the most? And I think we can also then ask the question of, because you also touch the base of race, and then we also think of gender, because it is gender-based violence. What does the gender inequality then say, or what does that also then lead to? And then what is feminism as well with it? So Edith, would you like to carry on? Thank you.
I think when we're looking at the idea of intersectionality, I think we also need to remember just intersectionality as a whole is looking at the overlapping disempowerments that people can experience and the overlapping ways in which people can be privileged or empowered, right? So I think particularly when you're in situations where you are being so greatly disempowered, quite like GBV, where in that moment so much is being taken from you, I think it touches on something that Oliver was speaking about earlier, about like what it takes to then rebuild after that, is that we don't look at financially the costs that it takes to like rebuild, like the type of privileges that it is to be able to rebuild afterwards. I mean, we're talking about if you've been like harmed, then go and seek help. But that help then psychologically, that costs money. Legal help, that costs money. Removing yourselves from situations that can continue to be harmful and violent to you, that costs money. So that in itself is already now a financial privilege to be able to say, I have access to those types of resources, right? When you talk about whether or not people are going to believe your experiences or view your experience as being worthy or important enough to be held up and, you know, prioritized, that also then brings into question things like race, sexuality, gender. Like, we have people in society who are listened to and held in regard at different standards based off how their privileges intersect, right? And thus their experiences and like their traumas are thus delegitimized for those exact same reasons. It's truly heartbreaking because it's like within this already terrible subject, you have layers of awfulness, right? And it's weird to say that, you know, that some one person's experience of something traumatic may not be equivalent to another person's layers of like trauma, because you almost don't want to say to someone else that your pain isn't the same as someone else's pain, especially if the source material feels the same. But the way that it manifests itself afterwards and the way that you're able to alleviate that pain to yourself differs greatly. And it's so sad to have to see that occur, but I guess that's the harm in intersectionality as a whole, right? It brings to light the fact that, you know what, even in oppression, we are all completely different, right? I think there was, I can't remember the name of the author, which really sucks, but there was this article talking about the experiences of Black women in the 1970s, 1980s, during the Black Power movement and the women's movement, Double Jeopardy. And she's looking at how, like, even within the women's movement, Black women are being marginalized because they're Black. And then within the Black Power movement, Black women are being marginalized because they're women, right? And so you have both of these spheres where you're almost trying to debate which part of your identity you're trying to prioritize, and you're being harmed in both of them, right? When you have to look at nuances like that, there does need to be an intersectional lens in how we address GBV and how we understand how it is experienced by different people.
Thank you so much, Edith. That was a very nice answer. Can we then move to Caitlin as well, who would like to close this question?
Yeah, so just to like add on to what Edith was saying about this idea that like you almost don't want to like compare people's like traumas and say that the way that people have experienced traumas is different. It's not the same, especially like when it's coming from the same place. And I think that is part of the reason why we can sometimes struggle with intersectionality and making the fight against GBV a more intersectional movement, is because people can almost view it, when you try and bring in this idea of intersectionality, people can view it as an attack on themselves and their trauma, and saying, oh, well, you didn't have it as bad as someone else, when that's like not the point of the discussion, and that's not the point of intersectionality. It's acknowledging the realities of the situation, that certain people are more likely to be victimized. Certain people do face additional layers of oppression on top of possibly the gender-based violence that they've experienced. And it's not about taking away from anyone, and not about minimizing or invalidating anyone's experience, but rather adding that level of understanding to fully appreciate everyone's experience as their own individual circumstances, and how that impacts them in a multitude of different ways. And I think it reminds me of something that I saw on social media the other day. Someone was talking in a post about how they were talking about gender-based violence, and they mentioned how specifically Black women are vulnerable to gender-based violence. And so many people in the comment section of that post were saying, well, why do you have to make it about race? Gender-based violence affects all women. This is not a race issue. Can't we just all stand together to fight against gender-based violence? I think that adds like another level to it, of like, we want to have this solidarity amongst women and people who have been affected by gender-based violence. And for many people, they think that solidarity can't come with also acknowledging the reality of the differences of the experience that people face, when it's not true. Like, we can have solidarity amongst women, amongst people that are affected by gender-based violence, while also acknowledging the differences in our experiences and the different vulnerabilities that people face. And it's not an attack on anyone to say that, yes, statistically, Black women are more vulnerable to being victims of gender-based violence than any other demographic. That is not attacking anyone, that is not minimizing anyone else's experience, that is just acknowledging the reality of the situation. And that actually is what allows us to help them come up with solutions and how to combat this. Because if we're not acknowledging that this is an issue that disproportionately affects people of a certain demographic, then our solutions are not going to be tailored to what they need to be.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. That last point was very, very, very well put. And I think that also then comes to question, well, not really comes to question, but it reminds me of when I was watching the Sophia de Bruyn interview, and when she says that, where she speaks about GBV and how even though they wanted to speak about it, they couldn't really speak about it as much as they wanted to, because the main point of focus was the end of apartheid and freedom of the people, and kind of putting to the side GBV. And I think then that also then reminds me of, if someone then wants to make a case against their perpetrator, the questions there are then asked to answer, and then have to relive the entire situation, and then being asked as if they were not the victim, but then the perpetrator of themselves. Like, what were you wearing? What did he do? And all of this, where did you walk? Why were you alone? All of those kind of things. And then my question then arises is, what does GBV, South Africa is known for our gender-based violence. And what does that say? What does it say as a community? What does it say as a country? What do we think about our women? What do we think about our children? And what do we think about our LGBTQIA community? And I'll start with Neil, please.
Apologies, I was unable to unmute myself. Thank you for that question. I think it's really interesting when we look at the view that South Africa has on women, and I kind of want to speak specifically on Black women, because I feel like there is a lack of agency when it comes to addressing Black women's issues in gender-based violence, Black women's protection. When Black women go missing, there is a lack of urgency to find them. I feel like the novelty placed on Black women is significantly less than when we look at, say, white women in the country. And I think that goes down to how our Black South African men are viewing their wives and daughters, and the lack of value that they are placing within their lives. And I think it's like, if we even take it to a very simple, relatable sense, in high school, I know I experienced a lot of other Black boys even saying that other Black women weren't their type, or they couldn't be attracted to a woman who's within their race, which just didn't make sense. And you would never find like white boys kind of regarding white women that way. There's a sense of like value that they place in the protection of their women that lacks in, I feel like, Black South Africans. So I feel like first and foremost, there is a need for that view to be redirected, and for Black women to really have a voice, and, you know, to be empowered through more ways than one. Like, it's not just a woman's fight alone against gender-based violence. We really need a lot more male representation speaking out about the issue. And I can't even imagine, when we look at an LGBTQ sense, what the oppression must be for then a Black trans woman or a Black gay woman, the additional layer of oppression that comes with that. As a Black woman myself, there's a layer of like cisgendered privilege that I'm born into that I don't have to experience out there. But like, so yeah, definitely just, I want to link it back to like intersectionality. I think is very important. But I also think that we can't ignore that Black women are also facing we almost feel like we are alone in the struggle, because I feel like the sense of like gender-based violence that they go through is very, very lonely. We don't even have our Black male counterparts to really put the novelty and price on our lives, which I think is very desperate in the country. So yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. And I think with what she said, I think there's also a certain stereotype that comes from being a Black woman, where you're meant to be the strongest in the room all the time, and you're not to like show any of your problems on like anywhere physically on your body. And I think that also then comes like, it makes it psychologically traumatizing, especially when you're a victim of GBV. It then goes, can you even say anything? Because then there's like this whole different kind of psychological pain that comes from then being traumatized by a man, but you now need to be strong because you're a Black woman. So I think that's a very interesting conversation, a very interesting point that you put out as well. I'd like to move to Oliver to carry on, please.
Thank you, Lydian. Our president called the GBV a pandemic of South Africa alongside the COVID-19 pandemic last year. And it just shows you the magnitude of this problem in our country and how many households it affects. So what I think South Africans think about women and LGBTQ, I think South Africans don't respect women and LGBTQIA community as much as they should. I think South Africans' opinions are very outdated, largely the older generations. And of course, as you grow up, you listen to your parents or your grandparents, and that's unfortunately how it's passed down to the youth. So we have very conservative opinions nowadays as South Africans, and that needs to change. It needs to change in households. It's not helping that we do it in school, because it hasn't changed. Life orientations, perception of teaching us about GBV is not helping. I think it needs to be done at the household level. So the best solution would be fathers being an example for boys and girls, just showing how you should respect women and children, and showing manners, and like someone previously said, practicing consent, just showing those manners and practicing them for the children to see.
Thank you so much, Oliver. This also then brings up the question that was asked again by someone in the audience: children in the gender binary be the same? And what are we telling our boys and what are we telling our girls? Puti, would you like to answer, please?
The same teachings offered to what are we saying to the boys and what are we saying to the girls have to be the same thing. We can't journey our way to a solution when we are taught to handle the issues in two different ways. I feel like for women and men, female and male, girls and boys, they need to be taught the same thing and the issues at hand at a household level before you could even the education level at a very young age, as I stated, is that this is a situation at hand. This is the issue at hand. We need to, they need to be taught of how we are all born equal in the situation and how this is how you go about it. This is what's plaguing and affecting our society. And how do we go beyond that to come to a solution, and also acknowledging and paying respect to the reality of people's issues, be it you in the LGBTQ+IA community or through that heterosexual lens. Yes.
Thank you so much, Puti. I think that's very valid in terms of what are we teaching our boys and what are we teaching our girls. I think there's this kind of boys are meant to be like, just wrap it up and you'll be fine. And then women, it's like, how dare you do this? Don't you dare wear that. Don't you dare do this. And it's kind of like you need to hide everything that makes you proud to be a woman, that makes your mother proud to be a woman, those kind of things. And can we move to Neil to close this up, please?
Thank you. I just wanted to add that I think it's so important what we do to tell our boys going forward, because I feel like the young men of South Africa, obviously, they filtrate what goes into society later on. And I feel like there's so many components into how we are raising boys in this day and age, and so many excuses that we have now been making for boys and the way that they behave. And I feel like so many of those excuses are now altered by reasons like, oh, well, that's just how boys are, that's just how they behave. But it's only because we never had these conversations before, and we let these harmful traditional misogynistic ideas just continue until we eventually had to just let them be, because there was so much damage. So I think for me, one of the most important things you can be is just a loud person in what you believe in, and a loud activist, because I feel like it's all good and well to have talks and go to primary schools and have an hour discussion about gender-based violence, but if that boy doesn't go back to his friendship circle and speak up against it when his friends are actually displaying the harmful stereotypes, it's essentially not going to be as useful as it needs to be. So I feel like it needs to be really encouraged and praised when we do see boys standing up in their small circles, even though you could turn around and say it's the bare minimum, but it's all we really have to work with at this point. So I think just encouraging boys to really be loud activists, and it's not enough to just kind of say, well, I'm not like my friend who disregards women and is just not a good individual. I'm better, but you still sit with your friends who kind of portray those behaviors and stuff. And then I think another one of the really big leading problems is catcalling in society. I feel like it's one of the most harmful things that I as a woman go through every day, and I know a lot of girls go through it. And I feel like it's also so normalized in male communities. And what I've realized at this point, I feel like a lot of South African males don't even realize what they're doing is wrong. They think it's so just it's endearing or whatever they think it is. I think as women, we need some sort of threat against daily abuse. I can't even go to the shop without guaranteeing I'm not going to get catcalled by one male. So I think a lot of gender-based violence problems start there. And we need to address those.
Thank you so much, Neil. And I think even if it is seen as the bare minimum, I think a little goes a long way. I think just starting with the little boys, even just saying that, then allows for a different kind of behavior to then articulate in his later life. And I think that's I think it's a little, but I think it's enough to start the ball rolling in that person's life. Edith, would you like to add?
Just on that point that Neo raised about that boys will be boy sentiment, which is so harmful, by the way. Like, starting from young, when you start excusing boys' more violent like behaviors, even if it's like sort of seen as like playful, kind of it compiles as they grow older, right? When they start being told to view some sort of violence within them as being, you know, boys will be boys, then we get surprised when they've reached adulthood and they're men now who have also normalized this certain level of violence, right? As, oh, you know, that was what that was going to lead to eventually. It's not like it was going to just cease at some point in time as they grew older, especially if there was never some sort of teaching that that was wrong and that there was better ways of handling situations, that there were better ways of engaging with other people, right? I remember when we were in high school, right? It was our matric year. And so the school I went to, we had a brother's school that was like right across the field from us. And we were having this like little war cry battle type of situation. And a whole large group of them started yelling out like derogatory, like sexual type terms to us as a school, right? And I remember when that situation happened, there was complete like outcry from our entire school, from like grade 8 all the way up into matric, of like, how could this have like happened? And how are there no repercussions occurring to them? And this was at like a very large public school day. How like are there no repercussions for them that this has happened at all, right? And it spoke to this completely for me, because I was like, how is this grade 8 boy now looking at me as a matric girl and thinking that they can say derogatory sexual things towards me, even if they're just empowered by their group, which is also part of the problem? How do you view that as being something you can say to another human being, let alone a human being you don't know, let alone a human being who you ought to have some sort of respect to as, you know, one of your leaders? I think that the culture that boys are raised within and the culture that they encourage amongst themselves definitely needs to be deconstructed and sorted out. I think it starts with those locker room discussions. It starts with those all boy like conversations where there aren't any women present, because I think particularly with the current day and age and with certain topics being seen as like, yes, you can say that and no, you can't say that, I think people have gotten very good with saying certain things when people are around. And then the minute that like women are removed from those conversations, all of a sudden it's okay, guys, we can put down that guise of feminism. Now we can actually say what we wanted to say, which is X, Y, and Z, dehumanizing women, not viewing them as legitimate people, right? We need to start deconstructing that. And like, then it does call on men who are in those spaces to turn around and say, you know what, actually that thing that you said wasn't cool. And actually that joke that you made wasn't cool. And dude, she was drunk. Why are you like trying to speak to her and chat her up right now? Like, that's not all right. There needs to be a sense of accountability, even when women aren't there to applaud you and congratulate you for it, right?
Thank you so much, Edith. That was very well put. Now to look at a practicality of this conversation. So in a hypothetical situation, if a woman then comments on a body of a man, so say like, oh, he has nice muscles, so on and so forth in public. In many a times I've like heard a man then say, oh, if the roles were reversed in the situation, it would be so much different. And he was specifically talking about if then the man were then commenting of the body of a woman. Could we then analyze this, firstly, this hypothetical situation, and then also analyze the response of if the roles are reversed? Can we start with Olwetu and then go to Caitlin, please?
Thank you for the question. So when I look at like the hypothetical situation and the if the roles were reversed comment, I can't deny the double standard of like, you know, women not wanting to be sexualized, but then sexualizing men. But in the same breath, we can't deny the sort of gender inequality and the power dynamics that are at play. We can't deny that, because a man's body isn't a site for violence. Me commenting on a man's muscles doesn't sort of create this like societal and deep-rooted notion that a man's body is just for sexual consumption and things like that. So I think the term, if the roles were reversed, yes, if the roles were reversed, it would be a problem because we have like a problem with gender inequality and the objectification of women and the sexualization of women and gender-based violence. It would be, if the roles were reversed, you're actually right. Yes, it would actually be a bigger thing because we can't deny the power dynamics and the gender inequality that have to do with it, the patriarchy. So I think many of us have come across like those type of incidents, whether it be in high school or whether it's just been like in our peer circles, we have these discussions and we say something and like a male will be like, well, if the roles were reversed. That comment also comes from like a place of ignorance a little bit, because in you saying that, you're sort of showing that you don't really understand sort of where women and femme bodies are positioned in society. You're not sort of understanding the crisis that female bodies are in and how they are violated in a very violent way. So that really is my take. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, that made a lot of sense. Thank you, Olwetu. Before we move on to Caitlin, you also pointed out how. Sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. Yes, so when we're speaking about a conversation like this, we've been speaking a lot about femme bodies and LGBTQIA for obvious reasons, but I can't help in the back of my mind when I've had this conversation similar with my friends, then a male-bodied cisgendered man would say then, oh, but men are also sexually abused and all of these things. Now, what does that different kind of tension and mean? What is the difficulty in a man saying that while you're having a conversation about the femme bodies in the space? Caitlin.
Yeah, so I think that's something that we hear like very often, is like as soon as you start talking about gender-based violence and the women and the problems that women in particular face in society, you are always going to have that person that says, oh, but what about male victims? And the thing is that it's very important to talk about male victims because they do exist and they do face like particular issues, especially when it comes to being believed when they speak up, being able to report incidents that they face, and it's a very important issue. However, whenever people bring it up and insert it into a conversation about gender-based violence that is specifically centered on women and the experience of women, it's never out of genuine concern for male victims. It's never out of a genuine desire to help, because if it was, they would be bringing it up independently of a conversation about women and women's experiences. And that's the problem that I have with it, because from what I've seen just in like my own kind of experiences in personal life, is that the people who talk about gender-based violence and talk about issues that women face and the patriarchy and misogyny, they also speak about male victims at different points when that is the conversation that they are having. Whereas the people that come into a comment section on a post or come into and bring up male victims, that is the only time that they are bringing up male victims. They're never going out of their own kind of independent volition to say, look, I think this is a serious problem in society and this is what I want to talk about and this is what I want to do about it. And these are the kind of solutions that I see to the issue. It's always a reactionary response. It's never a proactive thing of, this is an issue that I want to talk about. And the thing is like the issues that male victims face in terms of like, if you say, how can like men won't be believed if they report instances of sexual assault, or men will be ridiculed if they report instances of sexual assault, that a lot of that stems from the patriarchy, which is things that activists who are fighting against gender-based violence are trying to combat. So the reason why often men are ridiculed or not believed is because there's this perception that men have to be strong and men are dominant in society and they are powerful and they can't be victims, and that women are weak and they are docile and they are the ones that we can perceive as victims. So it's by combating those structures and those perceptions and ideas that we can actually help male victims and help them be able to come forward and share their experience.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. I think then I'll just like to say a few quotes from the chat, because I feel like it very much mirrors what you were just saying. a lot of the most instances due to victimization these individuals face their trauma alone, and also affects this have extended families. And then another one said we should teach boys that cooking and baking are basic life skills and not gender roles. And then another one says, but it goes beyond objectification. It has to do with sticking to the principle of not doing it, period. I think then also with what you said, Caitlin, and also what our panelists said, and then also what we've been getting from the chat, there's a lot of anger that comes into this conversation, and justifiable anger. When thinking about the government response, or even smaller, the municipal response to the abuse of women, and how we treat our LGBTQIA community and how we validate the experience. So I would like to ask Putty first. Is community vigilantism a good reason for the ongoing violence against women and children, specifically in terms of the validation that we are given to these victims?
This is a very tricky question because this issue is so complex and so heavy that not much is being done about getting the validation for the victims or being heard. So one way of being heard is that we have to use violence ethics, community vigilance. That's the only way we get heard, because we do things the mature, cordial way, we get silenced, so we never heard of. But when we do things in a much more loud and violent, aggressive way, then we get heard. But that's not the way of going about it. But you understand the frustration and the anger that these victims have, and the people that are indirectly and directly affected by them. It becomes a very complex thing to try to unpack and try to comprehend from both sides of you being the person in position of power and who has the stature of responsibility to help this ongoing situation that's been plaguing our country for so many decades, but also the victims that are also being faced with this oppression and are marginalized. But, if push comes to shove, if your voice isn't heard, if your actions aren't being taken seriously enough, then one way of going about it is to take force, to take action. I'm not saying completely condone it, but I think that's the only way you can ever get heard in this country that we're living in at this moment, period.
Thank you, Putty. I'd like to move to Edith then to also give on any practical advice on how we can actually speak about this issue and combat it and hopefully eradicate it.
So I just wanted to first look at the vigilantism and then the practical advice. It always comes to mind for me this Nelson Mandela quote on violence is the language of the unheard, right? And I always try and keep that in mind whenever I start to look at like protests and demonstration, and like for that reason, I've always given myself this sort of understanding of, it's not for me to question the means by which people try and get their voices heard or try and bring about change. I think you can look at the intentions behind people and ask, okay, what is it that you are trying to do? Why is it you want to do it? What do you think you seek to gain from this situation that we can maybe bring into question? But particularly with how bad GBV is in South Africa and how little of a response we're getting from things like government and police, it does come to a point where you can understand why people get to the point where they say, you know what, we're going to gather at midnight and we're going to take that person from their home and we're going to take them to a police station. You understand the frustration that has been built up. When you're seeing your children, when you're seeing your mothers, when you're seeing your friends being violated by this crime over and over and over again. And it's the only crime whereby you never look at the perpetrator, you start looking at the victim first and you try to delegitimize their claim for safety and try and explain away why this sort of violence was allowed against them. You understand why it gets people to that point. And it's weird because I believe in legal systems and I believe in the structures we have in place. And I believe that if they were actually to be used the way they're meant to be used, that we can actually exact the change that we need. The issue is that they're not. And so you can understand why we're getting vigilantism within communities. I know there's this group of women in India who go around and they attack the male perpetrators of GBV within India. And like, it's weird because you don't want to condone it, but at the same time, you completely understand where they're coming from and why they've been forced to this point, right? And then this idea on like practical advice, it's so difficult. I think a lot of parents have as a knee-jerk reaction, particularly parents of like female-bodied individuals or LGBT people, is to say, okay, well, do this to protect yourself and do that to protect yourself, and like, you know, sign up for self-defense classes and share your Uber information with someone else, and make sure that you're always in groups, never be alone when you're out past this time. And like I remember I had this one incident, and when I was talking to my parents about it afterwards, my mom's knee-jerk reaction was, okay, well, are there any self-defense courses nearby that maybe we can sign you up for, and make sure you're not alone in situations anymore? Or like, if someone else goes to the bathroom and that's the only person you're with, go to the bathroom with them. So at least then the two of you are together, so that you're not on your own sitting there by yourself anymore. And you understand it because they're looking at it purely from a safety perspective. But I think when we start trying to look at the tactics of how do you prevent it from happening, as opposed to looking at the root of it, you're saying, listen, if it had to happen to someone that night, make sure it's not you, right? If someone had to be abused and violated, make sure you're not that person, that it's someone who's unfortunate in that situation, which is such a heartbreaking way of looking at it, right? You wouldn't look at home break-ins as just make sure it's someone else's house that gets broken into. You're looking at it as everybody's house needs to not be broken into, when you try and stop everyone from experiencing this situation. And I think in trying to deal with that, especially if we're not receiving the governmental and like police reaction that we need right now, is you need to start looking from parents, schools. How are we teaching this, right? How are we engaging with conversations and consent, and how are we breaking it down so that there can't be any sort of confusion as to what consent is, right? For perpetrators, how are we teaching them the wrongs of what they've done, and like how we, I'm trying to remember the word right now, in Parktown and Joburg, and they take young sexual assault perpetrators, right? So these are like kids or teenagers who are like committing these acts right now, and they try and fix that sort of violence that has been taught into them. Like, how are we rectifying that? I think it takes small little actions, and it takes people on an individual basis, like actively doing something, as Judge Kate O'Regan says, like it takes everybody doing something to make things better, right? How are you talking about things like that with your younger siblings? How are you engaging in those conversations with your friends across the gender spectrum? You know, everybody needs to be involved in this. It can't just be left to higher institutions to sort these things out, because then we'll be waiting forever.
Thank you so much, Edith. Nick, would you like to add on? Oh, actually, before you add on, I'd very much like to ask the audience if they would like to ask any other questions to our panelists. Yeah, thank you, Nick.
Thank you. I'll keep this very brief. I want to talk about violence specifically, and the definitions and the messaging around the word violence, because because we were just talking about vigilantism, and vigilantism only exists because people feel like the structures that we live in aren't doing their job to protect us, so we take it into our own hands. And as Edith just laid out so beautifully, there's a myriad number of reasons as to why that would happen. And I think one thing we need to remember is that protests against anything, for the most part, we have fallen into this idea that peaceful protest is the way to go. Now, I'm not going to argue that, but I want to look at is, why are so many peaceful protests then later on labeled as violent? Why is it that the state seems to have some sort of stake in breaking up these legitimate protests against these issues by labeling them as violent, allowing their own security forces to move in and enact their own violence on these protesters? So I think that what I want to get at is, we just need to be, when those in power start saying certain things and start pointing towards and start speaking in these coded phrases, whether it be the person who has experienced, who has been harmed by GBV, being told, or being that they are constantly gaslit by those in power, we need to be very careful and ask ourselves a step back and say, there's always a reason as to why there's this almost infinite source of doubt in victims of GBV. And I believe simply that it is because a lot of the people in power either have perpetuated GBV themselves, or in either way, whether they are holding back and not doing anything, they are at the end of it still maintaining those structures. And I think in terms of practical advice, and like Edith and everybody acknowledges, it's incredibly hard to talk about of actual advice, but I think pointing towards male-bodied individuals and men in general, like there needs to be a sense of ownership that it is their and our problem too, that has to be solved, that like it's completely fine to lose a friend because he's a rapist. Like, I don't know about y'all, but I don't want a friend who's a rapist. If I had to find out a friend had to be a rapist, guys, they're not my friend anymore. I don't care what has to be done. I will report them as soon as possible, because what they have done is so heinously disgusting. I don't even want to be associated with them. So yeah, in terms of advice, it shouldn't matter to you that this person you may have had good times with this person, but if they're perpetuating a violence so disgusting, it should tell you something about why this person should no longer be in your life.
Thank you, Nick. I would like to move to Caitlin on giving practical advice, please.
Yeah, so I think my practical advice would go back to the motto that I shared at the beginning of never being silent and being loud in your activism. And I think that's really important from like a practical standpoint of making sure that people know that you are a safe space for them through your voice and how you use it. So always speaking up when there is misogynistic jokes that are being made, speaking up when you know that someone is doing something wrong, and making it very loud and very clear that you do not tolerate that kind of behavior, that you do not tolerate those kinds of acts of violence or assaults, or even those what people may deem as harmless jokes, making it clear that if someone has been a victim, that you are someone that they can confide in, that you are someone that they can speak to, and that you will support them. Because I think creating a sense of community is really important, and making it known that victims are not alone, and that there are people that are there that are willing to stand up for them, that are willing to come together and help them in whatever way that they can, even if that's just being an ear to listen and to provide a shoulder to cry on and to provide some sort of comfort. And I think that's where it starts, is if you make it known that this is something that you won't accept. And like Nick said, not accepting that kind of behavior from your friends and from your circle, removing people from your life if you know that they do not stand for the same values as you when it comes to gender-based violence, and making sure that someone knows, like, for example, if your friend has been violated, if they become a victim of gender-based violence by someone else that you know that you are the type of person that will believe them and that will take their side and won't say, oh, but I'm sure they didn't mean to harm you, I'm sure they meant well, or trying to stay friends with both parties. Like, making sure that you are always being loud and proud in your activism, and making sure that people know that you are always going to stand up for them. And I think that can really help foster that sense of community that we need to make sure that everyone feels.
Thank you, Caitlin. Very much be loud and proud in your activism, because that can help a lot of people. I would like to then move to Neil to finish on giving practical advice, please.
So my practical tip would be, as a content creator, and I know a lot of us here are in the theatre space, stop kind of creating content that portrays harmful stereotyping, and stop telling stories that can essentially be harmful going forward to gender-based violence, and stop like reaching for this typical stories of, you know, women getting abused without a real message in the story, and kind of just hoping for just that graphic illusion of the story to captivate like an audience. So I think also promoting like movies that are really problematic, and promoting songs that are really problematic, like movies like fight club that have a lot of interest, like this really be an accurate representation of how men should behave today. And I think a lot of these things are really problematic, that people just kind of go, oh, well, it's a classic and it's my favorite, so I know it has problems, but they just kind of move on. So I think, like I'm just personally going to stop promoting content is harmful.
Hi, sorry about that. We have a point given to by the audience. He says, or they say, sorry, my only concern with vigilantism would be the fact that it would operate from a word of mouth standpoint and not necessarily a factual standpoint. And it's dangerous because it leaves room for false accusations, which is why it is primitive for our government to step in and fight GBV at all costs, so that all parties can have a hearing. Edith, would you like to comment on that, please?
Yeah, even when I first brought up like vigilantism, see, it's difficult because like I can't bring myself to be either for or against it, simply because I like when I stop and I really like try and understand it from both sides of the spectrum. It's yes, on the one hand, these people are angry and frustrated and, they feel unheard. And if nothing else is being done, then you can understand what's bringing them to this point. On the other hand, it's messy and isn't always true, and a confession coerced by a crowd of people isn't necessarily an honest confession. I think if you were surrounded by 30 people at midnight and you've just been dragged out of your bed, yeah, you're probably going to say whatever it is the crowd wants you to say in that circumstance, right? And so we have a lot of situations where you get untruthful responses and you get like untruthful like reactions coerced out of people because they want to protect themselves, and that's what the situation is called for them to do, which then once again throws back into this idea of, women aren't telling the truth because look at that circumstance where this guy was forced to say something, or look at this guy where this guy was implicated in something and it wasn't actually him, right? It's messy, right? I think one thing about the GBV chats that we need to accept upfront from the very beginning is the whole situation is messy, right? Realizing that one of your friends is an abuser is messy. Realizing that there are certain biases that you might have been grown up with that aren't correct and actually bring about violence to other people is messy, right? There's nothing clean cut and easy to really say black, whites, this is exactly what it is that we need to do. Try to come up with answers like that. And so I don't have an outright answer on, whether or not vigilantism is something that we should or should not condone. In an ideal world, we wouldn't need it. In an ideal world, our institutions and our systems in place would actually work the way that they're meant to, but they don't currently, right? And the reason we can see that they don't is because of how prevalent this is and how how few people receive justice, whether it be because they come forward or because they don't, or because police stations laugh at them or don't take their situation seriously, or they don't know all the correct procedures in place for collecting evidence right after it happens, because you have to go and give your clothes away straight away. And if you shower, all of a sudden, all evidence is removed. The whole situation is nuanced and complicated. And I think to outright condemn or accept any one response to it isn't accurate and isn't fair to the nature of the situation at hand.
Thank you so much, Edith. Olwethu, would you like to close?
Yes, I think everyone said such important points. I wanted to also just add on a little bit on community vigilantism, I said that correctly, and sort of tie it to the practical tip, or sort of what needs to change in order for us to lessen GBV, if not completely stop it. I think that the community vigilantism is as a result of our justice system failing us and failing survivors. The community feels as if they have to take it in their own hands type of thing. We're at that point where the government isn't doing much to believe survivors, represent survivors, protect survivors, and things like that. So that falls under like one of my tips. I don't know how we're going to go about it in terms of restructuring the government and restructuring the justice system so that it represents survivors of GBV and it protects us. And then another tip that I stand strongly in, and I also wanted to tie in what I said in the beginning with the motto from Dr. Buthelezi, is the desire to want to stop GBV. I think it needs to come from boys, it needs to come from men, it needs to come from women, because there's a lot of internalized sort of misogyny and sexism that is prevalent. But I think there needs to be like a deep-rooted desire for us to want this to end. I think that also goes hand in hand with education, breaking free from stereotypes, dismantling power dynamics, actively working, having these discussions, going out, working towards gender equality, working towards that, because I really feel as if basically like tradition and culture and religion, they all in different ways perpetuate patriarchy and gender equality. And those are the two main things from my understanding that sort of drive this culture of gender-based violence. So that's how I would like to end it. I really do. I feel that it lies in how we raise our boys, how we raise our children, how our schools teach us life orientation, how our schools teach us sex education, the conversations that the boys have, the conversations that the girls have. And I use those terms very loosely, I apologize. So yeah, for me, it's that's where I see it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olwethu, and thank you to our panelists. We have one more point put up by the audience asking, how do we feel about 10-year-olds having babies? I think that is the scariest thing I will ever come to know in my entire life. I think that is terrifying. I remember I went to Home Affairs one day and this girl came in and she looked like she was 10, 8, and she had a baby in her arms and another one in her stomach, and I was heartbroken, absolutely heartbroken. I think it's a very scary world that we live in, that a 10-year-old, even younger, can be given birth. I remember I was also watching this video on social media where a woman said that you can't say anything about people who are against abortions. That's a whole nother conversation. Can't say anything about it because they've never, if they can say something about it if they've done surgery on a 10-year-old girl, a C-section, because her uterus wasn't big enough to carry the child. I think that's also very terrifying. And then the question also then arises then, why do we need to educate our male adults on not wanting or not sexualizing a child, an infant, baby girls walking to school in their school uniforms? I think that's also a very interesting topic. But yes, and then there's also another point that was just put up by the audience, Neo's point, with regards to content is interesting because both male and female artists benefit of the misogyny that's portrayed through it. That is also a very interesting point. Would anybody like to respond? I can start. In terms of artists that's benefiting of misogyny and the patriarchy, I have a very, very angered response. In terms of people like, and I will name and shame Chris Brown, I don't think anybody should be listening to his music. I think that someone like him should never, ever have been put on radio ever again after he was accused of abuse. Not accused, well, he was accused, and then evidence was put on that he did do what he did, and he's done it again last year and this year again. And people have said, no, he has a child, he's changed. He has not changed. He's the same man he was 5-6 years ago that he did what he did to Rihanna. Same thing with R. Kelly. R. Kelly was not so long ago put into jail, but people were still defending him, which makes no sense to me. And then also, I forgot with the man that shot Megan Thee Stallion. I saw someone posted on, oh, now he's doing well, but you're bringing up what he did to Megan Thee Stallion, where he shot her foot because he asked her to dance. And then he said a slandering word to her. That is a whole different conversation because, yes, you should bring it up again, because why is he still being able to make music? Why isn't he in jail for shooting a woman's foot? Because he wanted her to dance. And then again, if we bring it home, President Zuma, it's another conversation. But we're going to move to Caitlin to carry on.
Yeah, I feel like there's far too many men that have literally committed crimes. They've committed assault, abuse, and they are allowed to get away with it. But to Clement's point of that both male and female artists can benefit from the misogyny that's portrayed, and that that both men and women allow this type of behavior, I think there is like an element of truth to that. And like if we look at the things about like, you know, teaching children and how we're going to teach them to be better and not to kind of grow up in a world where these sorts of things are acceptable, it comes from not only the men in their lives, but it also comes from the women in their lives. And there is a certain level of, there are a lot of women who perpetuate misogyny against other women. And you can see this in like conversations that you might have with them. You can see this in the way that they treat their own children, their sons and daughters. There are a lot of women that actually reinforce those types of gender roles. And that's something else that we need to consider, that it also kind of comes back to that conversation of intersectionality, where a lot of the time it's like privileged white women who do get some sort of benefits from the patriarchy because they are in a position that is at least like superior in a sense to other women that are more economically vulnerable, women of color, and they basically then endure the kind of misfortunes and the negative aspects that they suffer from the patriarchy because they can use it to their advantage. Like the examples of white women who use their womanhood in order to victimize Black men and make accusations against Black men, and use that kind of patriarchal stereotyping of white women being seen as innocent and Black men being seen as aggressive to their own advantage. And they kind of found a way to work in and adapt in the system that is beneficial for them, but that harms a large number of other women and people in general.
Most definitely. Thank you, Caitlin. With that, we have finished our panel discussion, our last panel discussion for the year. I would like to say thank you to our panelists for joining us throughout this year and being open to discussing our lovely servant leaders in the interviews with Professor Daniel Plaikes, and then also sharing their thoughts. I'd also like to thank the audience for joining us with this panel discussion and the many others. If you may have not watched some of the other panel discussions, I tell you to watch all of them, and analyze and discuss with family and discuss with friends, because these are conversations that you do not want to miss for having yourself, and also the having to listen to them from our youth. Also like to thank you to our panelists for joining us today, joining us this morning, to our audience for joining us today. And then also, if you have any other queries or questions, then you can send us any messages on the Servant Leader website, on the Servant Leader social media sites. Yes, but that's it from me and my panelists. Have a good Reconciliation Day, and reminder to stop GBV because it's not cool. Thank you.